Keep on riding with us as we continue to broadcast the balance and defend the discourse from the Hip Hop Weekly studios. Welcome back to Civic Cipher. I am your host, Ramses Ja.
He is Ramses Ja. I am Q Ward. You are tuned in to Civic Cipher.
Indeed, you still are, and we appreciate that. Today we are having a wonderful conversation. I'm doing a little bit more listening, but to be fair, Chris and I got to talk twice. So Q, it's you two have your conversation. But we're having a fantastic conversation with Christopher Towler, PhD. I'll make sure I have that. Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science at California State University, Sacramento, Director of the Black Voter Project, and the Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Race, Ethnicity, and Politics. And we are talking about the data of Black voters. And I know the election is over, but there's still a lot that we can learn and are learning right now from Black voters. And of course, Dr. Towler is helping us sift through his data. But before we go any further, it's time to become a better ally, Baba. And today's Baba comes from the Black Information Network. This ain't Amazon, it's the Black Nile. A Black woman has created an app called the Black Nile, a Black version of Amazon where consumers can shop from Black-owned businesses and services on one platform. As major companies and retailers, including Amazon, Target, Walmart, and more, are rolling back their diversity, equity, and inclusion policies and initiatives, customers are looking for ways to support small and Black-owned businesses. I'm going to add this, and to boycott those, people that turn their back on us. All right, let me continue. UI and web designer Dacia Petrie, I believe I'm saying that right, used her background in technology to create the Black Nile to fulfill the need and make it even easier for shoppers to buy Black-owned. The app currently features 3,000 Black-owned businesses across over 40 categories, including skincare, hotels, restaurants, grocery stores, luxury wear, handbags, weddings, home and kitchen goods, baby and kids, plus-size clothing, and more. Quote, I saw somebody in the comments saying that they're looking for a Black Amazon. Sister, I'ma hold your hand when I say this. This ain't Amazon, it's Black Nile, unquote, Petrie said. Petrie integrated Google Maps into the app, allowing users to easily locate nearby businesses and retrieve directions. Shoppers can also leave reviews on the app after visiting or experiencing their selected business or service. Quote, I created this with the intention to make shopping with Black-owned businesses as easy as possible, Petrie said. He goes on to say, I am a UI designer and web designer, and I noticed that there are a lot of Black-owned directories, but many of them aren't as user-friendly or optimized for our mobile devices. I saw someone in the comments saying that they were looking for something that's a little bit more techy and something a little bit more user-friendly, and this is perfect, end quote. So again, check them out. It's Black Nile. All right, so, the two of you obviously have been talking about drawing some meaningful conclusions from the data, really, and setting the record straight, because that obviously is very important as we kind of get our bearings as a people, as we get our bearings. Many of us vote Democrat, so as we get our bearings relative to that party, and I feel like we might have stopped you a little short there. So any last words there you want to pick up?
Yeah, we were talking about sort of building solidarity, in the lack of solidarity between parts of the Black community. And I had noticed in the data that there were some differences, especially between sort of younger Black Americans and older generations. Mm-hmm. And I think it comes back to this connection to history, connection to generational struggle, especially the civil rights movement, where younger people now, right, people who have grandparents or maybe great-grandparents that lived during the civil rights era might not be preview to some of the conversations that we were and our parents were growing up, where we were hearing direct stories from relatives who lived through it, if not our parents, right? And so building that connection is a bit different because now people are hearing these stories second, third hand, if at all. And we already know, the push to get rid of Black history, to remove these stories from the textbooks and from our education altogether, all in the sense of trying to destroy this solidarity that the Black community has had for generations, right? Since really the civil rights movement and the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, there's been this sense that the Democrats are the party for civil rights, the party for the Black community. And that seems to be waning a little bit. That's not to say that there's a lot more people, as we talked about, voting for Republicans, but there are fewer young Black people that strongly identify with Democrats or strongly have a liberal ideology. And that can, become a threat to Black solidarity in the future if the party politics do not take this into consideration and find a way to speak to these young people in ways that still brings them home and still connects them to their history and to the rest of their community.
Dr. Towler, we talked about the turnout in the election. I want you to use data to tell a more full story that, may give people some nuance and some context. We said that the percentages were about the same as the prior election, but I thought I heard you mention that the numbers and the turnout may have been lower, even though the percentages of voters was the same. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that means or what you think that means?
Yeah, so there's some nuance here in this conversation, right? On the one hand, we're talking about who people voted for, which I like to call vote choice. And that was pretty much the same as 2020. And so we didn't see much shift in vote choice as far as how many Black people voted for the Democratic candidate, in this case Harris, or the Republican candidate Trump. Where we did see change is in the raw number of people that actually came out to vote. And there were significantly less Black people voting in 2024 than in 2020. And for the first time in a long time, we actually had fewer people cast a ballot than the year before, right? Every year since pretty much the Obama years, the number of Black people voting had gone up and up and up. This year it fell off. And in some states, such as Georgia, we know that Black voters are the only group where turnout dropped, where every other group turnout rose. And what that does is that creates sort of this situation where the gap between the amount of Black voters and other voters grows wider in a case like 2024, making it less likely that Black voters can affect an election. And in a state like Georgia, where almost 30% of voters are Black, it's very, very important that everyone gets out and votes so that they can have the same effect on the election in Georgia as they did in 2020 when Georgia went blue for Biden. In 2024, with less voters actually turning out to vote, even though the same or more voted for the Democratic candidate, the state turned red because you had far more of other types of voters, predominantly white voters, coming out to vote, shifting the ballots the other direction, right? And we see this taking place across the country. We don't have raw turnout for every state yet. That typically comes from the Secretary of State's offices across the country. But in places like Georgia, where we do have those numbers, it's very clear what's taken place, and that getting people out to vote was the issue this year, not trying to figure out who they were going to vote for.
We spoke about solidarity. We also spoke about post-election, post-inauguration, hopelessness, frustration, and apathy. Leading up to the election, however, and this is where this kind of lack of solidarity rings very loud to me, with what we were obviously facing as a people, like the threats to our safety, our health, our access to information, resources, capital, education, the erasure of our history, our access to opportunity. Once upon a time, and I think you hit the nail on the head, our ancestors, our parents, I use my mother as an example because when she turned of age, it was not yet legal for Black women to vote in this country. So this is not 300 years ago. This is not my great-great-grandmother. This is my mother. With what seemed like a very clear and obvious threat to us more than everyone else, how were people so comfortable not participating this time? Like this idea that I'm just not going to vote this time. I'm just not going to participate. How do you think we got there?
Yeah, it's a tricky situation. And for me, studying not just Black politics, but politics and social sort of predispositions, over the years, the idea of racism has changed quite a bit. And the racism that our parents and our grandparents faced was a far more overt segregation that was outlawed in many ways by the Civil Rights Act. So since then, racism has become far more covert and harder to just point out directly, right? There's absolutely still clear racism and bigotry out there, but the systems have become far more secretive in the way that they perpetuate racism, where now it's about, okay, did I get the job because I was black or because my name sounded ethnic, or was it something else that happened in the job interview, right? Did my house get evaluated differently when it came to the appraisal because of the artwork that I had in that might be African American, or was it because of something actually having to do with the house? And these are the types of questions that we have to ask today when trying to figure out where racism and discrimination still lives in society. And so it makes it harder to point them out. And it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort, especially for people, as we've said, these younger generations of Black people who haven't grown up either experiencing segregation or a lot of direct overt racism themselves, or haven't talked with elders who experience this. And so they are sort of one step removed from our history of extreme overt segregation and racism, something that has dictated the way our institutions work in this country today, but it's much harder to see. You can't just point it out and say, oh, you can't go in there because you're Black, right? You can go in there, but you might get followed around by the security guard. And if you've never experienced that and you don't know what you're looking for, it might not be as obvious until it's too late, right? Until you have that experience where you end up getting arrested, you end up spending some jail time, right? And if you don't know the statistics, right, about 1 in 3 Black men in their lives ends up incarcerated at some point, right? The highest rate in the country, right? And the United States is already has the highest rate of incarceration in all world democracies. And so these are issues and problems that still persist, but they're far more difficult to sort of put your finger on it and say, there it is. That's the racism that I'm talking about. That's the institutional oppression that has always been there, but still exists. And so when we see an election like the last one take place, and we have a lot of different messages being put out, sometimes on social media where you only get like a 3-second clip or a 10-second sort of video saying a message, and then you get 60 of those videos in 10 minutes, it can be that much more difficult to really decipher what's really going on, what people really stand for, and where you need to stand when it comes to choosing a political representative or a political party to get behind.
There is no justice until there is justice for all. That echoed in my head throughout the election cycle as I watched those who oppose us other all of these separate groups that would be attacked. And I bring up the othering because it gave people an opportunity to say, oh, okay, that thing that they plan to do doesn't affect me, so I don't think it's that big of a deal. And as we see people, the clean version is messing around and finding out, they are realizing that these policies and these agendas that seek to oppress anyone can very quickly oppress everyone. Ramses and I have a video of the show online that's circulating, that's somewhere close to 10 million views, where we discuss having biracial children, Hispanic, Latinx biracial children, who could very well be affected by ICE raids and talks of deportation, and how their friends, teachers, their parents and classmates look at them at school has been different since this divisive rhetoric has become the norm. When we're talking about DEI or deportations or anti-LGBTQ initiatives, it always startled me that even any Black people could kind of step back and remove themselves from fighting to defend other marginalized communities. Something that I thought would have been something that brought us together more than separated us. From your purview, what has that looked like post-election, as we're seeing people realize, oh, that thing that I thought would only affect other people is now knocking on my front door?
Yeah, it's somewhat difficult to watch. I think that there's definitely people, even people within the Black community, who are realizing how real the things got so quickly, right? And it wasn't like Trump's first term where there was some stumbling around and it took a couple years for things to get off the ground, right? There was this plan, Project 2025, that was put into action very quickly. I will say this, though, there are and always have been a segment of the Black community that is just conservative, right? These are people who are Republicans, who are going to vote Republican no matter what, many of whom, right, don the MAGA hat with pride. They're not being affected by these changes, right? They're looking at what's going on and they're satisfied. This is something that they really wanted to see happen. They understood these consequences. And so there's always going to be certain Black people who side with the oppressor, if you will, and who are willing to give up sort of this solidarity or this idea of what's best for their community for these individual Republican notions of what's going to help them get ahead, right? And what's going to benefit them in their personal lives and those beliefs. But there's absolutely this sentiment, right, that, oh, things are happening really quickly. My worry, though, is that there's far more Black people who are like, yeah, that's fine. You know, that we're now in the find out phase and we're just going to watch everybody find out. And we're just going to sit back and people are going to have to deal with this. And to me, I understand that sentiment. I really do. But it's a very dangerous sentiment to place ourselves in because we as Black people then lose our political voice. And if voting becomes more difficult, if there are elections in the future where our vote could change things and doesn't, it's going to make it that much harder for us to assert ourselves and re-enter the political sphere in a way where we can really make a difference and continue to have the impact on elections that we have had, say in 2020 and in local and state elections in 2024 and going forward. And so that's really the worry for me, right, is that Black people are going to take a step back and everyone's going to be thinking everyone else is going to pick up the slack, but it's not going to be enough. And then when it comes time for elections to be had and decisions to be made, Black people are going to suffer, right? Because we're going to have to deal with the consequences of political actions.
Recently, the president signed an executive order that is going to, or that seeks to overhaul elections comprehensively, and of course, unilaterally, with, I think, close to 57% of Black people electing to vote in person, and I think 31% on election day, as they seek to make voting more difficult in general. How is that going to impact Black voters that want to show up and that have not turned a blind eye and who will not sit out? I think they know where they want to focus to make voting more difficult. What is that going to look like for us moving forward?
Again, I think this is a difficult question because elections right now, with the way our country is polarized, are really won in the margins. And it can be that 50,000, 100,000 votes that make a difference, right? The state of Wisconsin was decided by less than 30,000 votes this past election cycle. And so it flipped back to red by such a thin margin where these questions about, okay, is having some sort of ID, valid ID necessary to vote, that proves citizenship going to change things. And what it's going to do is it's going to affect things at the margins. And you're going to have active voters, people who vote and are engaged in politics, figure out how to get this ID, figure out how to vote, right? They're going to find the resources to do it. But there's going to be those people on the margins who maybe don't vote all the time, or young people who are thinking about voting, but maybe are undecided, who are going to be affected by this type of legislation, and it's going to cause them not to vote, right? That extra step of finding the right ID or figuring out how to get proof of citizenship, or figuring out where to go to get extra documentation just to register to vote, right? If this law ends up being upheld, which we'll see what happens because states typically have the final say when it comes to voting, especially since the gutting of the Voting Rights Act in 2013. But if Trump's executive order ends up being upheld anyway in the courts before 2026 or 2028, it's going to affect things at the margins, and it's going to make it even harder for Democrats or anyone else trying to mobilize Black voters to get those people at the margins off their couch into the polls. And that's always been the debate behind voter ID laws, right? Is well, is it really a barrier to certain people? And yes, it is, right? There's always going to be disproportionate disadvantages in communities such as the Black community, where there are less resources, there's less information, there's less political knowledge because of the historical alienation and removal from politics that the community has faced for generations.
They look to make voting more difficult and they look to make voting inconvenient for the direct purpose that you just stated, to impact our community in difficult ways. Dr. Towler, to say we appreciate you, man, is just not really saying enough. I want to say thank you. I know my brother wants to say thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Though he's already spoken to you, but honored to have this conversation with you and hoping that we can continue these conversations because we need it, and so does our community.
Sure. And again, to be able to sit here, for those, I'll speak for us in this kind of journalistic space. A conversation with you is like a reset, and today I actually got to be a bona fide journalist because I did less hosting and more producing, and just to listen to that conversation, it imbues the energy around here with the kind of motivation that we need. For those of us looking for a glimmer of hope, it's kind of like, well, all hope is not lost. The narratives that had been successfully chronicled by those on the right, now, they're on shaky ground. And some were entirely unfounded altogether. There's still work to do, of course, but again, a conversation like this certainly does help at least those of us that are in this space, and we have to continue having these conversations. So with that, I want to make sure that I thank you on behalf of all of us here at Civic Cipher. Before we let you go, do us a favor, shout out any sort of social media websites, anything like that where people can go get more information about you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. Again, you could find all of the research and results posted on blackvoterproject.com as well as the blackinsightsresearch.com websites. And you can find me on Twitter, formerly Twitter X, and Blue Sky these days at Black BLK Prof, PROF CCT. And again, I just want to say thank you. And just to highlight once more, this election was a punch in the gut to the Black community. Seeing the potential for a first Black female president sort of go up in flames. But this is nothing new, right? Tough times are nothing new for Black people in America. And as we've learned, history can tell us sometimes the biggest steps forward come from the darkest times. And so I'm really hoping that, we see immense change come from this dark era, change that not only brings hope to the Black community, but changes the country for good as well.
And with that in mind, we will leave it right there. And until next week, y'all.
Peace.